Hello, everybody. Greetings. Speak up. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here in the Sherborn Library this evening. I'm delighted to have so many people there, and you should know there are a good number of people who are listening and watching in Zooming from various parts of the world, most notably Sherborn and Holliston, and who knows. But my name is George Fisk, and I serve as the president of the Sherborn Historical Society. And this is the fourth in a series of lectures that we have given over the course of this year, 2024. And of course, this is our 300 and what year is it? 50th anniversary. And we all have really enjoyed a wonderful year. It's been just terrific. Sometime earlier this year, it became apparent that we had a neighboring town that was also celebrating an anniversary. And I knew from my youth that Holliston at one point in time was a part of Sherborn. And I thought, my gosh, they're celebrating their 300th anniversary, our 350th. What the heck happened 300 years ago? What did we do wrong? Anyway, I have to tell you, where I live in Sherborn is right near the Holliston line, as I mentioned a little earlier to somebody else this evening. When I'm at home, and if I pull out my phone and I want to look at the weather, sometimes it says I'm in Sherborn and sometimes it says I'm in Holliston. So I don't know what, well, I do know why that is, but nonetheless. So we're looking forward to a nice talk tonight and entitled The Big Split. And what we have done is I was in touch with the Holliston Historical Society people whom I know, and it suggested it would be a nice talk for us to have. And here we are this evening. The people who are going to be the featured speakers are Betsy Johnson, our own town historian, and Joanne Hulbert, whom I've known for many, 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 many years. And she is the Holliston town historian. And so they will be speaking this evening. You should know that this program is going to be run once again in Holliston on December 3rd, I believe it is, the evening of December 3rd. And so if you felt you missed anything or you want to hear it again, maybe there's opportunity to do that as well. I will tell you that, as I'd mentioned, there are people who are Zooming in on this, which is wonderful. But we are going to allow after this an opportunity for Q&A, and here in this room, but also online. And although they are muted, the Zoomers, they are able to ask questions via the chat feature. So we'll deal with that when the two speakers have concluded their remarks. At this time, I would like to introduce Sheila Adams, who is my counterpart in Holliston, and it's been fun working with her and with Joanne and certainly Betsy. But Sheila, if you'd like to share a few words, love to hear from you.
Good evening. My name is Sheila Adams, and I'm president of the Holliston Historical Society. I'm not from Holliston, but I've lived there for about 50 years. I married a Hollistonian, but since I've been there for about 50 years, it makes me almost a newcomer, I think. My husband was from Holliston. His name was Jared Adams. Being an Adams in Massachusetts, we were often asked, are you related to the Adamses from Massachusetts? Of course, we all know just who those Adamses were. And the answer is no, not descended from, but yet same family. Henry Adams had 9 children. So there were lots of Adamses who were spread around, even though only one son remained in Braintree. But my husband's full name was Jared Hopestill Adams. And he was named after Hopestill Farm. My father-in-law used to say that they named him Hopestill because he had seen the sign on the side of a barn. But he is a descendant of the Lelands. His mother's name was Dorothy Leland. She lived in Holliston. His grandfather was Percy Leland, who was born in Sherborn in 1870. So there are strong ties that the family had to Sherborn. And one of the topics which Joanne is going to touch upon is the strong ties that still exist between Holliston and Sherborn. And so welcome very much to all the Holliston people here who I see also, and for the Sherborn people, happy birthday.
If I can spill water on the computer. Can you hear me? Okay. Holliston was part of the original Sherborn Town Grant for 50 years. To better understand how they came to split in 1724 into two separate towns, it might be helpful to know a little about what life was like in Sherborn in the years leading up to the division. This map shows the town bounds by 1701. And if you notice, there were certain parts that had been taken out. So the actual part of the town went like this. Down to the Charles River and back along by Natick, the Sudbury River and Framingham and Ashland and back. This is the area that was swapped out in order to get the center of town. This area they found overlapped the Menden grant, so it never became part of Sherborn. And this point down in here is right about at the intersection of 126 and 495, if you're familiar with that. This shows the town bounds by 1701. The next official map would not be drawn until 1795. Except for minor adjustments, the town boundaries had become permanent. Political. There had not yet been any population census taken, but this sketch map fragment notes that about 1723, there were 82 families on the east side of Doppingbrook and 47 settled or settling on the west side. If my math is correct, and we estimate about 7 members per family, husband, wife, and 5 children, that would give a total of 903 persons. Vital records were kept by the town clerk. Apparently, there was a fee because some of the poorer settlers did not enter births right away, and some not at all. As in Sherborn today, there was an annual town meeting, then held in the meeting house on a designated day in March, after a warrant had been posted listing the articles to be voted upon. If the business took too long, the meeting could be adjourned to an additional day or days. However, only men 21 and older could vote, no women. Deeds and wills were registered with fees in Cambridge, the Middlesex County seat. The widow, termed the relict, inherited 1/3 of the estate, the eldest son 1/3, and the rest of the estate was divided up among the other children. That made it necessary to have an inventory to establish the total value of both land and personal effects. Now those inventories are gold mines of information. The town militia, made up of men ages 18 through 60, still met monthly locally and annually at the Middlesex County Regimental Muster. There were still occasional alarms from pirate attacks along the coast, but more serious were the Native American raids along the northern frontier, New Hampshire and Maine, in what became known as Father Raleigh's War or Governor Dummer's War that lasted from 1722 to 1725. 5 Sherborn men were enlisted and served stints in 1723, and considerably more would go 2 years later. Males age 18 and older paid an annual poll tax. Property owners paid both a town and a colony tax. Men were also expected to work on local roads. Land related. Within the present Sherborn, there were no more common land left to distribute. However, much in the western end of Holliston still was available. Because the vote to distribute had been made before Holliston separated, those lots went to men from both towns. Also, there were 2 grants of land that the general court had given Sherborn in the present Douglas, Mass, as compensation for an area lost to Framingham in 1710. They had already been allotted. A third in Douglas from a 3,070. Sorry. Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
A third in Douglas from a 3,700 acre parcel that Sherborn purchased in 1721 also would be divided up among men from both towns, but the controversy over building the second meeting house put that on hold until 1730. Judge Samuel Sewell, age 72, had inherited several large properties in both towns and wrote in his now famous diary of visiting them from time to time. In present Sherborn, they included 100 South Main Street and also 128 Hollis Street. Religion. There was only one church available for worship, the Puritan one. It was congregational in structure. That is, each was a separate and independent entity and was supported by everyone's taxes. There were 2 services held each Sunday and a lecture on Thursdays. Everyone was expected to attend, although often in bad weather or in winter, mothers and their small children couldn't make the trip. The congregation was made up of 2 types of people. There was a small number of members who had passed an examination about their beliefs and had had some kind of conversion experience and testified about it in public. By far the larger number was all the rest, who were attendees but not members. 38-year-old Daniel Baker, the only college-educated man in town, had been the minister for 12 years and would have been the most important and influential man in Sherborn. He was married with 3 children and had 2 African-American men in his household, one listed as servant, but the other listed as slave, and had come to Reverend Baker by way of his second wife. The first meeting house was located in the town center, about where the UUA church is today. The basic problem leading to Holliston's splitting off was that the old building, completed in 1684 or 5, had been outgrown, having served as a community center, a meeting house, for 61 years. All agreed that it was most cost-effective to build a new building. The question became, where? I'll come back to that later. Education. School was taught by a town-paid schoolmaster, male, who rotated among the 4, sometimes 5 districts. In each, classes met in a room in someone's house for about 3 weeks. The districts were the Plain, serving the town center, South End, the area around South Main Street and Bullard Streets, Dirty Meadow at Ebenezer Leland's house on Ash Lane, and sometimes either Bear Hill for North Sherborn or Farm Road for that area. There was no school in Holliston unless children walked to the Bear Hill site. But interestingly, that was apparently not mentioned as a problem in the original petition. Transportation. Local travel was still quite primitive. Roads were little better than trails, taking the high ground rather than going through swamps. Passable in dry weather, but difficult to impassable in wet weather. The county road, mostly the present Route 16, had not yet been laid out. Most people went by foot, Shank's mare. If they owned a horse, they might ride it and take the wife behind on a pillion. And some families may have gone by oxen in a two-wheeled cart. Four-wheeled wagons were still in the future. Communication. Communication was minimal. There was only one weekly newspaper regularly printed in Boston, the Boston Newsletter, which mainly reprinted old European news. Whether or not any issues reached Sherborn is unknown. We know almost nothing about mail also, except that sending or receiving letters was rare and expensive. England and her colonies continued to use the Julian calendar, which started the new year on the traditional March 25th. To avoid confusion with those in other countries who used the Gregorian calendar, they double dated the period from January 1st to March 25th, as in February 3rd, 1723/24. And you can see here in some of these entries, you can see the way they double dated it. Economics. Everyone farmed, even the minister. Men used oxen for heavy work. Horses were still lightweight and mainly for riding. Foodstuffs and medicinal herbs were raised by women in kitchen gardens. The men raised primarily grains, corn and rye, but not wheat because of the wheat blister rust. Grass for hay and livestock, cattle, swine, and perhaps a few sheep. There was very little hard money in circulation, so people continued to pay their debts, either with produce, a kind of barter, or by keeping track of the values of debts and credits in a notebook. Care of the poor. The town supported its own poor. What they did was to auction off his or her support to the lowest bidder for the year, with the town reimbursing the winning bidder. Often, but not always, that person was a family member. Usually, additional bills were for coffin and burial expenses. Environment. Farmers continued to clear land. It took about a year to clear 1 acre, and burned the excess wood and brush. They all had woodlots from which they cut firewood and logged for lumber. Architecture. All the buildings were constructed of wood with hewed beams and sawn lumber. They did not build log cabins. Houses were small, probably like this one by Henry Leland. And the house itself ends right about there. And unpainted. When wanting more space, they often added an addition in the shape of a salt box with a long sloping roof to the north. This is an example of two old house settlements down on the old cart path that goes from the end of Bullard Street. If you miss Bullard Street at South Main Street and keep going, you go down the old path. You can see where King Philip's Overlook is. And at that time, when the painting was done, which is probably the early 1800s, there weren't many trees right around there. It would hold a large kitchen and have extra flues added to the chimney. Windows were small. Glass was still expensive. And in winter, the heat from the fireplace must have been minimal. Here are 2 more examples of salt box additions. And if you notice I don't know how well I can show this, but because the house was unpainted, you could see additions that were made to it. Several different additions, extending it. Medicine. If one got sick, the housewife first tried out her home remedies, and if they didn't work, she would consult with neighbors. If that still didn't work, she might call in a doctor from Medfield or Dr. Eliezer Hill, the only Sherborn physician. However, since no one knew the causes of disease, the physician could only treat the symptoms. Usually, the doctor was called in as a surgeon to treat broken bones or severe wounds. Burns from fireplace cooking were common for both women and small children. Sherborn children were generally born at 2-year intervals, so some kind of birth control must have been in common practice. Women had their babies at home, accompanied by neighboring women, and or perhaps Dr. Eliezer Hill's wife, Rebecca, who was known as a skilled midwife. Mothers often died from complications, especially from infection, termed childbed fever. If the mother died, often the infant did too. There were periodic epidemics of a variety of diseases that raged through the wider area. Smallpox was one of the worst. It usually entered through the port of Boston and reoccurred about once every decade. In 1721-22, Boston had experienced its worst of the 18th century, with an estimated half of its population getting the disease. That was the time when Reverend Cotton Mather and Dr. Zabdiel Boylston introduced variolation, inoculation of actual disease serum to produce a mild case, they hoped, and thus immunity. The Sherborn death records do not list cause of death at this period, but they do show a higher number of deaths in 1721-22 than in the years both before and after. The only known link to variolation and Sherborn is through Judge Samuel Sewell, who had variolation done upon himself and 3 other members of his family. There were undoubtedly other epidemics too, but they are undocumented. There were 2 graveyards available for the dead, who were generally buried in family groups. Old South Burying Ground is on South Main Street, Route 27, about opposite Bullard Street, Route 115, and served those in that part of town. The other was the Central Burying Ground, located at the junction of North and South Main Streets with Washington Street, on what was then part of the town common. It was used by those near the town center and elsewhere. Farm burying ground may possibly have been in use then also, but the oldest existing dated stone there is 1786. As far as we know, there were no small family graveyards. Daily life. Although men did the heavy steps in processing flax, women and girls spun the wool and linen yarns, wove the cloth, and made most, if not all, the clothing for the family. Compared to today, people had very few clothes and layered them depending on the season. Women also did the food preparation, cooking in multiple pans at the kitchen fireplace and on the hearth. Men and boys worked with crops in the fields and barn and raised the livestock, mainly cattle and pigs. If a spouse died, to keep a household together, it was almost universal that the other needed to remarry, and soon, especially if there were small children. When she married, a woman's property passed to her husband. If they had children by previous marriages, there sometimes were some rather complicated prenuptial agreements to assure that the first husband's property would eventually go to his children rather than to the second husband's children. There is virtually nothing in town records about recreation. Christmas was not celebrated in Massachusetts yet. Recreation for adults was apparently limited to the weekly church service and occasional group work like house or barn raisings, quilting bees, and the like. Children would have had simple homemade toys, probably dolls, hobby horses, willow whistles, etc., and undoubtedly played with the farm animals. Crime. There is also virtually nothing in town records about local crime. But if it were minor, it would have been heard by a justice of the peace. And if major, it would have gone up to the colony courts, even perhaps eventually to Judge Samuel Sewell's Massachusetts Superior Court. Details leading to the split. Now we come to the nitty-gritty. Voters had agreed that the old meeting house needed to be replaced, but the burning question was where it was to be located. Settling that question polarized the town and took some pretty fiery town meetings over a period of 4 years. There were several possible sites considered. Those who lived in the eastern part of the town, now Sherborn, were happy to continue using the town common. However, those who settled west of Dopping Brook felt that sign was too far away, that site. It was too hard to make the long trek to attend church. They evidently petitioned the town either for a closer site or to become a second church parish, although the petition does not seem to be in any Sherborn town records. Then began the series of contentious town meetings. When the issue first came before town meeting in February of 2021, 2 articles were presented. The committee of 3 men from each part of town requested that the site be near to Dirty Meadow Bridge. You can still see the causeway to Dirty Meadow Bridge. It forms the so-called dam at the Woodland Street end of Ash Lane. The site they favored was on the hillside on the north side of Greenwood Street. The house there is now number 82, near its junction with Woodland Street. If that site was not acceptable, they proposed that a line be drawn, quote, from the southeasterly corner of Framingham line, along Dopping Brook to Bogastow Brook to the Medway line, and that a new committee be formed representing both sections to consider what to do next and propose any site likely to conduce to the peace and well-being of the town. The meeting was continued to the next month. The March meeting must have been a heated one. The committee gave its report and the original petition was reread for, quote, after long debate, a phrase very seldom used in town meeting records. It was voted upon article by article and all were defeated. The town next voted the backup article, the dividing line, which is essentially the present boundary between Holliston and Sherborn. Although not stated in the Sherborn records, the implication was that the western area would thereby become a second parish. Debate continued as town meetings were held and adjourned to further dates, still debating. The elected town meeting moderators seemed to reflect which side had the majority at any given meeting. Obviously, no real consensus existed within the town, although all wanted to hold the town together somehow. In February 1721-22, the town voted a tax to fund the new building at the site of the old one. The next meeting, held in November, debated reconsideration of the previous vote. Evidently, the voice vote was very close and was immediately questioned by, quote, 7 men in opposition. It was decided by a roll call vote and found to, quote, pass on the negative. A roll call vote was a highly unusual procedure at a Massachusetts town meeting and certainly separated the sheep from the goats. One wonders if the division was entirely by geography. Nothing further is reported until the March meeting of 1722-23, when the Western contingent must have turned out in force. They voted to view the Dirty Meadow site, which they did. After, quote, considerable debate upon the affair, the meeting unanimously voted to build the meeting house there and to nullify the previous vote, quote, and so the town to abide and remain together for the strengthening thereof. They marked the hillside site with a heap of stones. By the November 1723 meeting, the 3rd year, people had given up all hope of compromise. They recognized that the shape of the town did not allow one convenient site, and that eventually 2 meeting houses would indeed be necessary. In its final reversal, the town voted to nullify the previous vote and to build on the town common. It set the amount at £160 and chose a building committee to hire a builder and to oversee the construction. As soon as the vote was completed, the Western contingent presented a further motion concerning the parish line. The farms of William Sheffield and Edmund Morse included small portions east of the dividing line, and the request was that all their holdings become part of the new parish. The Western inhabitants, in turn, promised to, quote, do all public duty to the town as heretofore till the general court shall set us off, except the cost of the new building. An official map drawn in 1724 shows the Sheffield Morse farms right in here. This is the current line. It comes along down here. Shows the Sheffield Morse farms entirely in Holliston, and the town line still makes a jog there. That meeting seemed to end the east-west controversy over the second meeting house site. After 3 years of heated argument and debate, the town was to remain united, but to support 2 parishes. The saga was not quite over, however. In April of 1724, the Western inhabitants petitioned the general court to become a separate parish as planned. Instead, the general court decided to set the area off as a separate town, using the agreed upon parish boundary line as the town division. A map of that line surveyed 2 months later exists in the state archives, so this is a copy of it. As of November 1724, Holliston was no longer part of Sherborn, but a separate incorporated town, obligated within 18 months to choose a convenient site, erect and finish its own meeting house, and hire, quote, a learned Orthodox minister. The larger of the 2 towns, Holliston now includes 19.04 square miles, compared to Sherborn's 17.12 square miles. And the Holliston number does not include Holliston land lost later to Ashland in 1846. The division of the remaining common lands located in Holliston would still include Sherborn as well as Holliston families. Henceforth, although ties of family and friendship would remain strong between them, the 2 towns would go their separate ways. And Joanne will tell about that.
Thank you very much. Oh, okay, yeah, you want to do that. Otherwise, we can call them birds.
Let's see.
Those are birds, yeah.
See. Well, that might be something different.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, annotate. Disable annotations for others. There we go. And let's see if we can.
Good thing you're doing this.
All right. We're getting rid of it all. All right.
Got them all, yeah.
Perfect. All right. Sorry about that.
Oh, I don't know, I probably could work with them, I don't know.
And I just saved
Okay.
it, so no more should come.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm very glad that the 1724 boundary map is still up, because it will come into play later on, not the same map, but there are points on it. When I saw this map, I turned it around and around and around trying to figure it out, because the writing goes in all different directions, which is really kind of fun. But where Morse's farm has that arrow pointing to that little jig or jag there will come into play further on. So keep that one in mind. So I'm very glad that Betsy has put that one up there because it is important. So anyway, so we're going to carry on now because now in 1724, Holliston is now a separate incorporated town. So Sherborn and Holliston parted ways, sort of, but we will see what the sort of is like on the terrain here. So now we're going to start out, first of all, on one of the important persons who plays a big role in this story. And of course, it is Thomas Hollis. Who was he? Well, 1659 to 1731 are his dates. Harvard College benefactor, and he began sending donations to Harvard in 1718, but his biggest one was in 1721, right during that epidemic of smallpox. While that was going on, there was good news that was received by the Great and General Court that there was a whole bunch of money that was just given to Harvard by this man, Thomas Hollis. You remember him? He'd send a little bit here and there along the way, but 1721, the money that he sent, the 1,500 pounds per annum, as a donation to establish a professorship of divinity and also a professorship of mathematics and natural philosophy, which I even found even more interesting, actually. He donated a 24-foot telescope to Harvard, which was housed at Massachusetts Hall. And in 1764, all of Harvard's telescopes were destroyed by fire, as it happens. And what intrigued me about that was that Holliston had a certain person, Samuel Bullitt, Esquire, who apparently, I would like to think that he did spend some time looking through that telescope at Harvard because he had a very big interest in science, mathematics, and also astronomy. He mapped out the 1793 eclipse that came across Massachusetts. So I figured he probably maybe might have benefited from a lot of the things that Thomas Hollis had paid out to Harvard. But why would we name a town after him? In 1724, yes, he really impressed them at the Great and General Court. Keep that in mind, and we will talk about it later as to how or why he happened to get his name on the town. So, but I do want to go on to something very important that really kind of joins in with what Betsy was saying. It's about the people, the ones that she showed, the ones that she mentioned. This is the first book that was written about the history of Sherborn and Holliston together in 1856 by one marvelous person who I have been looking at for a long time, but Abner Morse. Abner Morse went around the two towns, probably with a pencil and paper, asking people to give him some stories for the history. But most of what he wrote in this book, 9/10 of the book actually is all a genealogical register, because back in the 1850s, this was a very big deal to go and trace all these families. It was really a big thing, still is today. But what he did was that he did write down all of these families, check them all out, put them all together. And what is interesting is that the people of Sherborn and Holliston were pretty much of the same, with the same families right up until the 1850s. Now, from the 1850s on, things changed with a lot of immigrants that were moving into Massachusetts that gave us a wider array of people in this country and state and towns. So, but up until this time, that's all you would find in this book. Now, if you are at all intrigued, okay, about this book and that you would like to acquire one of these books, they're very rare. I mean, I think all of us that are really into this local history probably might have acquired a copy, but all of you can, because this is one book that you can get in its entirety on Google Books. So if you are inclined to check it out, you can get your own copy. I mean, I suppose you could download it and print it all out, 250 odd pages as it is. Otherwise, go into Harvard Bookstore and they'll print off a copy for you for about $8 or $10. But you are able to have a copy of this if you are so inclined. But it really is really great to look at it because of the time that he spent, and what he found important at that time was about telling the town's history by way of genealogy. We're still doing it today, but this is the access to the materials that they had at that time in order to put together a history book. They did it through the history of people. Now, this is one of the maps that came out of the Sherborn records. And it intrigued me because it does show a bit of what eventually did become the town of Holliston. And there are two things on here that are of special interest. And if you can see way up there at the top, I didn't see where the little thing, but well, anyway, that straight line up there, which says on the top of it, it says Highway to Joshua Underwood. Okay, we do know about Joshua Underwood, thanks to Abner Morse in his work. And also, we will see the house that was Joshua Underwood's. We'll see that in a little while. But the other thing that really intrigued me about this map is that down the side, on the left-hand side, way down there, it says in very scratchy writing, it says Chicken Brook. And I have for a very long time wondered about what's with these chickens? What about chickens in the brook? I mean, were there chickens in the brook, or who had chickens? Well, this map goes back to the 17th century. I don't know that there were really a whole lot of chickens around, because mostly what the people were doing out in this territory was not as much farming as sawmills. Everybody wanted the lumber and the wood. Once they started getting that, yes, they would settle in and they would be farming at some point. After all, they're going to have to subsist on food, and then certainly not going to any stores anytime soon. And so then they would settle in with the sawmills and the farms and all, but I don't know about the chickens. So looking at it though, all of the streams around in this particular area, which became Holliston, the streams, the brooks, have names that were mostly from the Native American language. So looking into it, you can also get, if you are so inclined, if you are into languages, linguistics, as I'm kind of a language junkie myself, that you can get a copy that was published by the Smithsonian Institution back around 1903 on the Natick Indian Language Dictionary. First copy I ever saw of that was at the Natick Public Library, and I was lucky enough to be able to acquire a copy myself. And in that book, I looked up some words that sounded kind of like chicken, and there are. There is one, Chickanasawag. Another one is chickup, which is the word for cedar trees. And guess what grows along Chicken Brook? A lot of cedar trees. So the thing is that the European settlers around here were not that great at linguistics. They didn't really have a good ear for translating, except for John Eliot, of course, but he was the only one. So I've been watching on Chicken Brook to see where it came from and what it is. And I kind of settled on the fact because the other brooks around Holliston are also derivations from Indian words. This is the house that was started to be built anyway by Joshua Underwood. It is known today as Littlefield Tavern, which you can see at 1919 Washington Street. The house was built in 3 sections, apparently, and it was started by Joshua Underwood. Still is there today. It's a gem of a house, absolutely beautiful. And yes, it kind of looks like that. In those, but it is one of Holliston's great landmarks. Now, this is what is really fun when we get into the maps. This is a sketch of the towns around Holliston. As you notice, going all the way up there, my gosh, it goes all the way up beyond Lake Washaycom. Who knew? You know, absolutely. Because it goes all the way up to that point, all the way down to the bottom down there. And that is all of Holliston. Now, what I had done, so that you don't have to unless you really want to, is I did a very unscientific experiment to see what the distance is from the landmark at the top all the way down by following roads, which you can do today. So you don't have to. I'll tell you how it went. But the northern boundary up there where you see bridge up in the top there, that is a town line between Ashland and Framingham right now. And if you travel all the way down as best as you can on roads, some that did not exist back then, some that did, all the way down to the bottom, I drove that and it came out to 10 3/4 miles. That's pretty wild for the size of a town. It may not be all that wide, but it is definitely that tall. But stay tuned and see what happened to all of that. There's some interesting points in here. Some of them, as you can see in the middle of where you see Holliston, they have the meeting house, of course, and above it is Jasper's Rock. We're going to visit that one momentarily. But first, here is more of a scientific map, which was done by that man that I had mentioned, Samuel Bullitt Esquire. Marvelous man, very interesting and really a worldly man, but he was also a surveyor by trade. So here is one of his maps from 1793. And you can see even a little bit better than that other sketch, all the way up and down, all the way up and down. He is quite an interesting person to research. When he died, he was buried in the small North Cemetery in Holliston. On his gravestone, you know how you have an epitaph and you want to be remembered for who you were and what you were and what was important to you, apparently. And on it says that he was a mathematician. All right, what does that mean in 1850 jargon? Well, it means more than just good at numbers. And basically, a mathematician also in that sense is that he was a scientist. And surely he was. After all, his sketches for the 1793 eclipse are absolutely marvelous. They're just absolute historical gems. But there it all is. We have Chicken Brook in there. We've got another brook on that side. Up at the very top is Cold Spring Brook, which is the border that we had up until, well, that one hung on a little bit longer than the others. All the way up to 1846. And then you know what happened there. Now we start to get chopped away a little bit of pruning on all of the edges, all of them except for one. Now, if you look on that eastern side all the way down, and you can see a little bit of a knob that was also apparent on the maps that Betsy also showed. There's a little bit of a knob there. Now, the thing is, keep an eye on that. And also above it, as you travel up on Dopping Brook, which is the boundary there, that really messy one, it's the only one that's not a really nice straight line along there. There were a few problems with some of the land along there. And which kind of messed things up. And that Edmund Morse was one of the culprits on it. The thing is that he owned land on one side of Dopping Brook and a lot of other land on the west side of it. So it caused a problem when they were drawing up using the lot lines along with the Dopping Brook that they were looking at as a boundary line. Things got a little bit sketchy there. And you can see it's kind of a little bit messy up there. It's a little jig and a jag and all that, and also the knob down below it. That was because of certain land grants that people were not going to shave off on the corners at all. Now, keep an eye on those as we look at a few of the other maps. All right, here it is on a close-up. As you can see, that knob there, I don't know whether we should call it, Sheffield Knob because he did have land down there, or just who we're going to name it after, but it's still there. And if you would like to visit that spot, you can do that now because Fisk Street in Holliston, which goes into Sherborn, that's where that knob is. And above it, just travel up that red line and you can see some funny little jigs and jags up there that come over on the east side of Dopping, what are they doing over there? I mean, what a mess. Why didn't they follow the brook down? Well, that's because Edmund Morse had some land there. Another problem cropped up at the same time when they were drawing the boundaries further up. And it happened to Joseph Morse, who was higher up on there. And he went to the town meetings in Sherborn and he said, I don't know which side of the line. Am I in Holliston or am I in Sherborn? So things were a little bit testy on that, but he ended up mostly in Holliston. That would be land that is up on Elliott Street that comes from Ashland into Sherborn. And the thing is that if he had waited another 100 years, yeah, he would have ended up in Ashland. So, so he had quite a dilemma about who he was and where he was supposed to be. And they worked it out. But keep in mind those funny little jags there. And this is a 1965 map. And the 65 map shows nice, clearly, those little dots and everything, that Edmund Morse jig and a jag are still permanent boundary lines between Holliston and Sherborn. It is still there. It looks like it cuts into a couple of houses on Cranberry Lane, which is kind of a sad state of affairs, I suppose, for some people. But we never changed it. We never straightened it out. We never brought it down onto Dopping Brook. And it is one of those little memories and vestiges that we have that has stayed on the map of Holliston. And it is the one boundary line, that east boundary line is the only one that has never changed. It is still the same. So we have memories of Sherborn that are still there. So now Jasper's Rock, which we have heard a little bit about before. This is another gift that we received from Sherborn during the big split. It is one that you could visit. Story has it that Jasper Adams was up here with a small flock of sheep, and he would graze them on the side of the hill. And he would, according to Abner Morse, he would light a fire on this stone, and it would be a signal fire that his father would see in Medfield. And that he would tell his father that everything was all right and everything's fine. Well, that's a story from Abner Morse. And sometimes I wonder whether he's just trying to embellish things. I don't really know if that really happened. And it looks like kind of a funny rock to pile a bunch of things on in order to light a fire. But, it could be. But what is much more important about this rock is not that. It is a surveyor's stone. And they used this in order to survey and confirm the boundary lines of not only Sherborn and Holliston, but also even of Natick and Medfield and all the other points. And if you would like to go and visit that stone, in the upper right corner of that stone, at the very top, there is a divot in the stone, and which I assume is where they would have to place surveying equipment to be exactly precisely the same spot every time that they would do the surveying. And we find Jasper's Rock mentioned quite a number of times in the records, and it certainly is marked out marvelously in all of the Sherborn records as well. And so this is one gift that we have had from Sherborn, and which we are still taking good care of. And we continue to do that. But I think that the story about a surveyor's rock is probably a lot more historically, scientifically accurate. And I'll consider maybe Jasper piling up for the signal fire. Maybe that's a little more apocryphal. So now this is really fun. All right. This is another thing that occurred when this land was still part of Sherborn. And this has to do with Stephen Hopping. Now you can see Hopping Brook, that big, huge mass of streams coming down, which still does exist. Now, the thing is, hopping. What is it hopping over? Is it hopping over stones? Is it hopping over a dam? No, it has nothing to do with hopping anywhere. It dates back to the 1660s and 70s when a man by the name of Stephen Hopping would come out from Boston. He was a cow herdsman, and he would bring a herd of cattle I don't know why the distance had to be this far out. I can imagine. He would bring this herd out to pasture on land that was out in this area near this brook. That's how his name got on it. But who was this Stephen Hoppin? Well, we have to share the history, Holliston and Sherborn does, about this man. And according to records that we have found, mainly one of the best stories was written by one of Holliston's historians from the 20th century, Daniel Chase. And he did a little bit of work looking into the deeds and the grants and all of that. And he found out a marvelous story about who this Stephen Hopping was. Well, apparently, yes, he did come out and he pastured on this land. He owned a large tract of it. And he would bring the cattle out along a pathway out to here. And apparently, when he would leave in the spring, they said that so many people in the town of Boston and Dorchester and everywhere on there were very relieved to see him leave and go out to the pastures. And why was that? Well, because during the winter, on his sort of off season, he would come back to town right about now, and he would end up back in Boston with the cattle all fattened up and all. During the winter, he would spend his time along with some of his buddies carousing in every tavern in Boston. At one point, the town fathers asked his son-in-law, could you please see if you could keep Stephen under control because he was causing so much trouble out there. So when I drive along Route 16 going out towards Milford, I go by the sign that says Hopping Brook Park, which is right by Hopping Brook. I kind of, a little bit of a smile to think about how Stephen Hoppin would come out here, settle in with his cattle for the summer season, and then have to head back to Boston as they braced for his return. So since he was doing that when this was Sherborn, we can share in that bit of history. Both Sherborn and Holliston can share in it. So next time you go by Hopping Brook, it's not hopping over anything. It's just that they had a hard time spelling his name. Is it Hoppin or Hoppins or Hopping? And there was like 4 or 5 different spellings. So now this is one that is rather important to me because I grew up along here. Bogastow Brook is also another one of what we were given by Sherborn. After all, Sherborn was known as Bogastow briefly. Maybe we should have acquired that name. But Bogastow Brook is now all within Holliston. So it is another one of those gifts that Sherborn gave us, which is awfully nice. Bogastow, which is an Indian word. I won't get into any linguistics unless you're really into that sort of thing. You can ask me later, but about Bogastow Brook, which meanders its way all the way from Holliston now, all the way down to Charles River. It's a marvelous thing. Now, I promised to give a little bit more explanation as to why Holliston? How did it get its name? Why in heaven's name would we come up with that? Well, there is probably a reason for that as to how it was Holliston. I had wondered, did some of the new residents of this new town come up with it? Did somebody in Sherborn suggest it? Probably was not the way it happened. And as an example on the naming, we can look to the example of Hollis, New Hampshire. Ooh, Hollis, New Hampshire. Was Hollis, New Hampshire named after Thomas Hollis? No and yes. When the two towns, which were first known as Pelham and Hollis, New Hampshire, Hollis was spelled Holles, by the way. And that Hollis was the Duke of Newcastle. And his name was Hollis, yes. But the thing is, his name was Thomas Pelham Hollis, first Duke of Newcastle, Holles. All right. Those two towns were named by the governor of New Hampshire. And he did it because apparently this Thomas Pellin Hollis, he was the one that was responsible for getting him the job as governor of New Hampshire at the time. So he had to give him some sort of a thank you note, I guess. So, but unfortunately, shortly thereafter, the townspeople of Hollis, New Hampshire, found out about this Duke of Newcastle. And the description is really kind of interesting because luckily we didn't have to suffer through this. Okay, history says of him, the Duke, that he was of so feeble a head and so treacherous a heart that Sir Robert Walpole called him perfidy, that Lord Halifax used to revile him as a knave and a fool, and that he was so ignorant of this continent that it was said of him that he addressed his letters to the island of New England. So when word got out that this poor little town was named after such a person, thank goodness we did not have to suffer that with Thomas Hollis, they decided perhaps it was not the best person to honor their new little town. So what happened was, apparently, this could be partly legend, partly truth. This is the fun of it. That apparently two young men from Hollis, New Hampshire, were students at Harvard. And at that time, this is in the early 1800s, they noticed that there was a building called Hollis Hall, Hollis, named after Thomas Hollis. And they said, hey, this sounds a lot better. And then we found out about Thomas Hollis, and he's a heck of a lot better than this Duke of Newcastle. They went back to town, talked to the town fathers, and the name of the town was changed to Hollis. And that's how apparently, I love the story, it could be fact, could be legend, but that's what they said. So I think that's wonderful. But we, unfortunately, in town of Holliston, has been named after somebody with a lot better reputation. And how did it end up on it? It probably was the same way that the Duke of Newcastle had his name put on a couple of towns in New Hampshire, in that it was probably something that was suggested to the Great and General Court of Massachusetts, and they saw this as a perfect way to honor a man who was doing so much for Harvard. And they had him already and on the docket there, just waiting for some opportunity to honor him in that way. Did Thomas Hollis ever come over to this side of the pond? No, he did not. But he was informed. Reverend Thomas Danforth did send him a letter because he was acquainted with him, and sent him a note and said, hey, Tom, you've had a town named after you. This is really great. So he said, oh, that's really nice. So how do I best acknowledge and say thank you for this? Thank you very much. And what he did was he sent a Bible to the new church. So that Bible is still in possession of the Congregational Church, and it is still another relic that Holliston values very greatly. So that's how we got all the way around to Thomas Hollis, and that is probably exactly how it got named. The name was in the records of the Great and General Court as early as early November, right about this time. Then you could see that, we're putting the suggestion out, and it landed on our town, and we still have it. So I think that we're a lot happier about it. The first one that if we go back up, I'm going to go back up to that little picture of him. Okay, I love his wig. The thing is that Holliston did honor him further on in history. In the 1850s, Holliston Savings Bank had that logo on the money that they distributed. It was in no small way. He appeared in the image on the $1, $2, $5, and $10 banknotes from the Holliston Savings Bank. That was the logo that they had on it. So we have acknowledged the great deeds that Thomas Hollis did, and forevermore he will be honored and in the memory of the town of Holliston. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Thank you both. That's terrific to hear from both of you and to learn that history about each of the towns as one and as separate. We are going to take advantage of an opportunity to accept questions that any of you may have. We also are accepting questions through the chat feature. So if there are questions that people would like to pose to either Betsy or Joanne, this is a good time to do it. George.
So Thomas Hollis lived in England.
Yes, that's right. He never came over. A merchant of London. Yes.
All right, on some of the older maps, Sherborn is spelled differently, but pronounced the same way as it's typically pronounced by you all, not Sherborn, like we would say from our Minnesota. But you guys call it Sherborn a lot of times, Sherborn. But it's spelled differently in the old maps than it currently is. Explain that, and where did the name come from?
Two different questions. First of all, we don't know where the name came from. It was given by the Great and General Court. There are at least 11 Sherborns in England, any one of which could be the source. It's always been assumed that it was Sherborn, Dorset, England, which is the largest of the ones there, but nobody's been able to find connections, and they've been looking since about 1900. As far as the spelling goes, it's had, I think, 5 different ways of spelling it. You know, there were no rules of spelling in the early days. You spelled it as you happened to feel like it, and sometimes several times differently on the same page. So most of the time it was spelled B-U-R-N-E, but in 1852, there was a move within the town to get back to what they thought was the spelling on the incorporation document. Only they didn't read it properly, which is difficult to read. It's not their fault, but it was on the document, it was O-R-N-E, but they didn't see the E because it doesn't look like an E. So it became O-R-N. And from then on, why Sherborn was spelled as it does today.
Sarah.
That's what about wasn't Nantucket originally named Sherborn?
Yes, for a while there were 2 Sherborns in Massachusetts. Nantucket, the town of Nantucket was originally Sherborn, named after, I'm not sure who, but it was part of New York at the time, so it didn't matter. And then when that part became part of the province of New England, well, all of a sudden it became part of all the same unit. And genealogists have had problems ever since. Yes, there were. It became, Massachusetts was part of the province. And at some point they drew the line, and Sherborn, Nantucket was part of Massachusetts. So you had 2 of them. And it wasn't until I think it was 1795 thereabouts that the Nantucket one changed its name back to Nantucket. But every now and then the town clerk gets requests about, or the Historical Society gets genealogy requests for the Coffin family, it's not this Sherborn, it's the other one. Right, that's again, it got spelled differently over time. It was pronounced probably Leyland originally, and somebody finally spelled it that way. Henry himself signed with a mark. The first Henry who came, he was a tailor, and his mark was a pair of tailor shears. In the 18th century, they changed it to L-E-A-L-A-N-D. In the 19th century, they gussied it up by dropping the A. And so then it was just L-E-L-A-N-D. And that happened with a lot of names.
Any other questions? Yes?
If I'm understanding correctly, it seems like the townsfolk didn't ask to be separated for a new town to be formed.
Is that what you were saying? So they just.
Yes.
And then this general court decided to.
That's as far as I could tell, yes.
So there's no obvious reason. It's just.
No. We don't know why they changed it.
There's no fighting, right? No fighting.
Well, there's plenty of verbal fighting, I'm sure.
Energetic dare to go the first parish, once the second parish, or did you have to stay in there? And live in that?
Well, your taxes supported whichever parish you personally lived in. You perhaps could go to both, but you wouldn't, if the whole point was to be closer to home, why?
Like,
Wouldn't.
People look at gas. But I'm going to service.
I don't think so. That's the sort of thing that doesn't get into town meeting records.
I have one, I can add to that too. Yeah, okay. Yeah, good start on that. Yes, matter of fact, in Holliston records, even into the early 1800s, that is a similar dilemma. And they would say when they would put out a town warrant for a town meeting, for instance, they would say, to all the residents in blah, blah, blah in Holliston, except for those people who attend the church in Medway. There was a section in Holliston up to 1829 that was actually Holliston and then became ceded over to Medway. And actually Lake Winthrop was cut straight in half between the two towns. The old maps show that right straight through. And the thing is that there was that section where the people, are you in Medway? Are you in Holliston? Well, apparently because the people down in that section were closer to that church building. And there was one man, it was 12, he lived at what is now today 1212 Washington Street in Holliston. He is in this little bit of Medway that bled over to his house, but he was much closer to the church in Holliston, and he asked the Great General Court to kind of fix things up so he wouldn't have to go all the way 3 times the distance where he could walk to the church in Holliston. And actually, if you go on Washington Street, where that house is, you go right around a curve that's at Underwood Street, you would be in Medway at that point for about a half mile until you get up to almost up to what is Summer Street. And that little corner, and I often like to think of it that George Washington did walk through, Natick, Sherborn, Holliston, and a little tiny bit of Medway before he came back into Holliston, stopped at Littlefield Tavern for who knows what, for drinks and everything. And yeah, exactly. And that house, of course, Littlefield Tavern was originally Sherborn. Exactly. So yes, it is very, very vague and kind of strange when it came to like what parish you were with. Yeah.
Chicken Brook goes all the way to Medway because that's in Short Park.
Yes, it does.
There.
Yeah.
And I was always wondering why it was chicken.
So have I for a very long time. And so, yes. Yes.
Chickataway Road.
Well, Chickataway, yeah.
Why did they remember that brook?
Right.
We should go with you.
Yeah, it's Chickanaugawa, which is in the Native dictionary, which I presume that was the Native American language that was being spoken in this area. Now, remember, it's a total oral language, right? So it's all what they hear. Okay. Yes, I know. I wander. Yeah. Well, there's great discussion about that, about whether the Natick Indians, were they Massachusetts or were they Nipmuc? Now, of course, when you ask them, it was not a big deal between them. We're kind of on the line between the two groups, although they interacted with each other. That was kind of a European necessity to try to figure out if they were them or they were that, that sort of thing. It was not something that bothered the Indians. Now, Speen Street, for instance, that's from James Speen. Yeah, and Natick Indian. There are several books out that have been written, some academic books about the Native American population in this area.
Program at the village hall about the niblock.
Yes, yeah, nibmucks are, you know, technically or not, basically they consider that like southern Worcester County. Yes, you know, were they, but we don't have them anymore to ask, who are you and what do you think you are? Because that wasn't an issue with them, yeah, as being, you know, classified as one thing or another. Yeah.
On 16 in Holliston, isn't there a big plaque or something describing or making reference to a plague or great?
Oh, the Great Sickness.
Now,
Yeah.
I always wondered about that.
Well, it was known, it was known as the Great Sickness in Holliston, but Sherborn had a much more poetic description of it. It was happening in Sherborn as well. They called it the memorable malady. I always thought that was much more. They don't know. They don't know the description on it, some sort of a virus or whatever. The description on it is very difficult to tell. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's recent enough to have some substantial records.
Well, yes, but with a lot of diseases, especially if it was something that seems to have been new, they might not have had. I mean, when you think about it even today, I mean, it could have been something similar to COVID, for instance. It could have been, and it certainly wasn't the only one because there was one earlier in 1730s, I think it was, that was just as, you know, just as devastating to the population. But yeah, it lasted from like December, January into February. That was it, but it had such a high mortality rate, which is not unusual in, you know, before, well, even before 1900. I mean, the numbers of people who died of such things as tuberculosis. You know, when you look at the records, the town records, and you see like 5 and 6 and 7 and, you know, diphtheria, typhoid, everything goes bang, 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 all the way down. And the thing is that, was it always consumption or was it some disease that, you know, that was a wasting disease? But it hit age groups of like, you know, 18 to 40 in around there very, very, you know, devastatingly. Yeah. Oh, do we have any questions for? Okay, all right, good. All right, thank you. Yeah.
Well, I certainly want to thank all of you for being here tonight, and a special thanks to Betsy and Joanne for sharing all of that information. It's just wonderful. I'm glad I can still go over the town line, because otherwise I would have just felt awful if we didn't have Outpost Farm and Fisk General Store and the Superette. So we still have access to that. So thank you all very much. And I'm sure you'll be around for a few minutes if you want to ask a few more questions. Thank you.